Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Decision Hour. I'm Adam. With me, as always, my partner in crime, Patty.
Adam, how's it going?
It's going good. How you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm excited about today's show.
So am I. This is going to be kind of well, our show's always kick-ass, but I'm digging this because we've got a special guest on the line with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Why don't you do the intro and let everybody know what we're going to be talking about today?
Okay. We have a special guest. His name is Steve Black, and I have known Steve Black for a long time. I met him through my sister many years ago, a couple decades ago, actually. And he always just kind of stuck out at me because he was a little bit different. He was super cool. He was super nice. And Steve, I'm just happy to have you on the show. There are so many cool things that you're doing still today. You're still with the Chop Shop in Michigan, but you have so many things going. I don't want to mess up your intro too bad. So would you mind introducing yourself to our listeners?
Sure. I've been doing radio now for, this year, 2019 will mark 29 years on the radio for me. Almost all of that in Detroit, about 27 years in Detroit, and I'm in my 15th year in syndication, and that's where the Chop Shop comes in, which is a guitar-based rock show that airs on a bunch of stations across the United States. In addition to that, I'm currently active in a podcast called The Sound Of, which is a music talk podcast. A lot of fun, but not the easiest thing to search for. If you go search on the internet for The Sound Of, you will find everything on earth. But it's
I can imagine that.
It's a fun name because each episode we get to give it a subtitle, and then that makes it a little easier to search. One we did was The Sound of German Robots. If you Google that, you're going to find it right away.
Wow, that's cool.
I like that.
German robots.
I like that.
Wow.
Well, you never know where the conversation's going to lead, and that one led in a very strange direction. In addition to that, I work for WRIF in Detroit, and I'm an author too. I put a book out about 5 years ago, and working on a second one.
Now, today's show is going to be about retro music. However, I do want our listeners to know a little bit about where you're coming from. Can you tell us what was your first book about? What's your second book going to be about, if you're free to talk about it publicly yet? And then we'll jump into the retro music.
My first book was inspired by, and in fact was a last request of my first wife. My first wife, Sabrina, was diagnosed with cancer actually on our way to get married. We got married in Hawaii, and when we stopped over in San Francisco, she was, ill and got diagnosed literally 2 days before we got married. And she passed away 6 years later. And one of the very last things she asked of me was to publish some of her diary about what it was like to struggle with cancer at such a young age, because she was diagnosed at 29 and died at 35.
Jeez.
So that is what set the track moving. And it was actually a doctor who recommended to me, since I was having so much trouble. Every time I would try to write something sort of about her, I didn't feel like I was capturing who she was. So this doctor recommended I just write my life story. And when I got to, those chapters, I could use her diary. And once I did that, it just worked. Like, I captured who she was. I captured her energy, her thoughts. Because I wasn't trying to be her anymore. I wasn't trying to tell a story through her eyes. I told it through my eyes. Mm-hmm. But since all of this occurred while I was still working in radio, we interact and intersect with rock stars all along the way. So it's kind of a fascinating tale. So that's the first book. And then the second book is actually, I won't give away all the details, but it's more sci-fi based. And it's about, it's a spiritual journey that essentially I am on, but I'm doing it within a fictional world where I can set the parameters to force that journey to go in certain directions. So that's what I'm working on now.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Ooh, I love that. Yeah, that is super cool. Nice. So, what's the name of your first book?
Oh yeah, I forgot that part. It's called From Black to Light. And it is still 5 stars. Woohoo! 5 stars on Amazon.
Well, we are going to put a link up. We'll share that with our listeners for sure. So
you.
people can check out that book, and definitely let us know when your next book is out. I am really interested in that. As a writer myself, I am super drawn to fictional, and I do like sci-fi, so that's awesome. So Steve, retro music, what does that mean to you? What do you think retro is?
Well, it depends on the age of the person you're talking to, because I have a son who's 13, so to him, retro music is Shinedown. I mean, that band started before he was born. So a band that's 15, 16 years old is older than my son. So it just depends on where you're at in your own journey, where you're at on the timeline. To me, I probably would target it late 70s, early 80s, because that's when a lot of my firsts took place. And music tends to, it attaches itself to your entire storyline, but it's more prominent when you're experiencing something for the first time.
Mm-hmm. That's true. That's a good point.
Yeah, I like that.
I know Adam, he's talking about mullets and stuff recently.
He brought it up. I don't know.
He's like, we should do a live video and we'll get all dressed up and I'll wear a mullet and you can wear like your jelly bracelets or something.
It was either that or like the Afro perm,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
So what are some of, okay, so if we're thinking, 70s, 80s, and that's right around, our time frame as well, what would be, what are some of the bands that you remember, or the ones that, some of your favorite bands growing up?
My favorite band in high school was a Canadian band called Triumph. And they did okay, but they were never like, this mega band that, you can bring up in conversation and everybody remembers.
Right.
But they were, again, attaching themselves to first. The first concert I ever saw was a 4-band bill, and they were on the bill. They were actually the first band I ever met as well, the first autograph I ever got. Wow. So they've been a huge part of my life. And the frontman, the singer, guitarist for the band, has been a solo artist now for, probably 25 years. But let me see, I saw Triumph live like 17 times, and I've seen Rick as a solo artist, I think 15 or 16 times.
Jeez.
Wow.
So, that was a really, really big one for me.
Wow. Now, I going through your Facebook pictures this morning. Yes, I was stalking you, Steve, to see what you've been up to. I was looking at some of the pictures that you've shown of some of the people you've met. I would consider retro for sure, like Ozzy Osbourne. Who are some of the bigger names maybe that you've met, and what is one of the most memorable stories that you can think of from a retro musician that you've met?
Well, if I had to choose like an all-time favorite artist, which is impossible to do, but I might choose Alice Cooper.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, I'm massaging the truth a little bit here, but it did happen. I like to tell people that I sang with Alice Cooper, which of course would be my dream, but it was at Ted Nugent's 50th birthday party. And we had Alice Cooper on the phone, and Alice and I led everybody in singing happy birthday to Ted Nugent. So technically I did sing with Alice Cooper.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
That's so cool.
Oh my goodness. About how many concerts do you think you've been to throughout, your young adult through today?
I say 700. I don't really know. That seems like a somewhat safe number. Mm-hmm. So I usually, when people ask, and being on the radio, people do ask, but I think 700 is a safe estimate.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's a lot.
I should have said what?
Yeah,
huh?
I'm trying to wow.
Be able to hear it all.
Can you remember any of that?
Oh man,
Patty,
Adam, I know you're.
Go ahead.
You're probably chomping at the bit because you were talking about all these different bands that you listen to.
No,
in this,
I'm trying to think of like some of the like bands. Excuse me, bands, and then I got kind of like, well, there was other solo singer artists that were at that time. growing up, I remember, Stevie Nicks, parents listened to Floyd, Skinnerd was big in the house. I'm a Midwest, obviously I'm a Midwest kid too, you know what I mean? So I'm trying to think of like what we had available too at that time, because we lived kind of out in the sticks.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah, and Steve's like me. We grew up in Michigan. So Michigan has an awesome state for producing some excellent music,
Yeah,
for sure. Wouldn't you say, Steve?
Yeah, not only some of the really influential bands came from Michigan, but many of them were adopted by Michigan and are still tied to it. People still think Journey is from Michigan, and clearly they're from San Francisco, and people still identify Kiss as being a Detroit band, even though they're from New York. Jay Giles' band being out of Boston, but broke in Detroit. So, it's always been, my entire lifetime, it's been a hotbed for music.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, some of the other ones I think of is Van Halen, and then you get into kind of like the 80s heavy metal stuff like Megadeth and Metallica and stuff like that. But I grew up about an hour outside of Minneapolis, or just across over the Wisconsin border, and Prince was really big up in that area. And you really couldn't go anywhere because him being from the Minneapolis area. Prince was really popular up there. So, what about you, Patty? What were some of the other ones? What were some that you remember listening or grew up on? Like I think I still, when I go to the gym, I'm blasting AC/DC and some of the 80s hair bands and
Oh my goodness, who didn't like Metallica, AC/DC, Bon Jovi? And then I liked some of the pop music too, which you guys probably are going to kick me off the show here, but like CNC Music Factory, a little bit of Madonna. I didn't like her that much though. So
Jackson,
the Bangles,
the Jackson 5, when Michael went out kind of out on his own, was that like 83, 85, somewhere in there, I think.
One of the things that it has become kind of humorous on the podcast that I do weekly, which is called The Sound Of, is I've been so hyper focused on rock my entire life, and that's what I built my career around, that I missed some of the most popular things in the world. They never entered my universe. And the other two hosts on the show will make a point about a song from Michael Jackson or Madonna, and I have no idea. I've never even heard the songs. And they're like, how have you never heard those songs? And it becomes a joke. But, the reason I know the rock world so well is that's where I spent all my waking moments. And since I never listened to a pop station and didn't, if MTV wasn't showing a band I cared about, I just turned it off.
Right.
So, in a recent show, Rev mentioned Tupac. Like I was listening to Tupac when I was 14. I said I never heard of him until he got dead. That was the first time I'd ever heard of him.
He died?
The day he got dead. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So it's kind of funny because I can pull out some really fascinating nuggets, from bands that people have long forgotten. But at the same time, I really never connected to the mainstream.
All right, I got a question for you. You're putting together your own rock band, and it could be anybody from history. Who do you have as the lead singer? Who's your lead guitarist? Who's your drummer? I mean, if you're putting a band together, who's in it?
I'll start with guitarist because I find Steve Vai to be one of the most fascinating human beings on the planet. He's one of the kindest, most original musicians and human beings that I've ever encountered. I also think that he's probably the most talented guitarist that's ever lived. And for people who don't know the name, it's probably not a household name for everybody. Steve Vai started with Frank Zappa and then eventually became the guitarist for David Lee Roth. When David Lee Roth left Van Halen, his goal was to build a band that was technically better than Van Halen so he could go out and play those songs. He needed a guitarist that was at least on Eddie's level, so he found Steve Vai.
Wow.
He also played in Whitesnake for a while, and he has an amazing solo career. But he's just such an incredible human being. So I would start there.
Okay.
I would go Freddie Mercury as a singer because I think he can do just about everything. Plus, he plays piano, which is lovely. He's got an incredible sense of melody.
Yeah.
And I think his avant-garde nature would work well with the sort of alien thoughts and alien background of Steve Vai. I'd probably go Neil Peart on drums from Rush. Maybe technically the best drummer in rock. And he was also the primary lyricist. So very intelligent lyrics to go with it. And now a bass player that would work with all of those guys. I think I'll take a stab at John Entwistle from The Who.
That's a killer group right there. That's a really that's. I'd love to see that.
So
that'd be great.
Yeah, that kind of works in my brain. Yeah,
I like that. I like that a lot.
I like how your brain thinks.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
I spent a lot of time listening to all of those guys. So.
Man.
Now, one thing about you, Steve, is your hair. You have a lot of it.
I still have it.
Yeah.
Well, some of it.
Yeah, you have a lot of hair. When's the last time you had it cut?
Well, thankfully, my amazing wife, Gina, trims it up from time to time whenever she feels like it needs a bit of a trim. But as far as having short hair, the last time I had short hair, I remember vividly. I wasn't pleased about it, but when I was 17 years old, my mother said, if you will cut your hair above your ears and get a picture taken for me so that I can put it in my house, I will never ask you for anything else again the rest of your life. So I did it. I cried, but I got my hair cut above my ears. And
wow.
To her credit, Mom never asked me for anything that dramatic ever again. But to my dissatisfaction, that's the picture that still hangs in her house. It's that one. So
that's awesome.
But yeah, so when I was 17 was the last time I had short hair.
Oh,
wow. Yeah, you have some awesome hair. What if you were to describe yourself in the, let's say, 80s, because you graduated, you said in 84, how would you describe yourself looking back at you then, I guess?
An explorer first and foremost, brash, which may have worked for me at the time, but maybe almost, I would be embarrassed to be that brash today, but I suppose at the time who I was and what I was and what I was trying to learn to become, I guess it worked. Hyper-focused. Mm-hmm. Again, in many ways positive, and in some ways, I certainly could have been more aware of other people.
Mm-hmm. Oh, couldn't we all as teenagers?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that, but definitely the explorer and adventurer was first on my list at that age.
Mm-hmm. And when you were in high school, did you know what you wanted to do as a career, or how did this happen? How did you become who you are today? In a short, I know we can't take days to dive into that, but a short version, how would you describe how you ended up getting into your career as a podcaster?
I was always interested in radio and actually pretended to be on the radio when I was 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. And even as a teenager, I would make mixed cassettes back when cassettes were a thing. Mm-hmm. For, my brother, my neighbor, or some kid at school, and even go to the extremes of talking in between the songs that I would put on cassettes for them, and creating little production pieces. If the guy's name was Scott, I would make it Scott Radio, and then play another song for him. And I just did that because it always seemed natural to me. Mm-hmm. But growing up, essentially our backyard was a cornfield, and beyond that was an apple orchard, and we had a gun range and a bow range in our yard, it never seemed possible. It never seemed like that kid from the country would be able to get on the radio. So I didn't really pursue it. Many years later, I became a certified audio engineer, and one thing led to about 4 other things, but I ended up at a radio station, kind of making commercials and things. And because of a storm, a bad winter storm, the next person couldn't get into the radio station, and they called and asked me if I would go on the air. And so I did. Basically, I did. And I remember vividly when the program director called up after about an hour of me being on the radio for the very first time and said, "I thought you said you'd never done this before." I said, "Well, technically what I said is I'd never been on the air before." I said, "I've been doing this since I was 5 years old. Just nobody's ever heard it before. I was always in my room." But he said, "I think you're a natural." And that was it. I've been pretty much on the radio from that day forward.
That's pretty cool. Steve, why don't you give the listeners your links where they can follow you or reach out to you?
Twitter is just SR Black, as in like Stevie Ray Vaughan,
Nice.
but SR Black.
Okay.
I believe the Facebook page is Chop Shop Radio, I believe is my personal one. I kind of
It is.
mixed the two together. Yeah. Yeah, those are probably the 2 easiest. I'm on all the others, Instagram and all the others, but those are the 2 that I interact with the most.
Perfect.
And then where can people buy your book, From Black to Light?
Yeah, it's on Amazon. So that's by far the easiest, just Amazon.com. Might want to use my name too. Depends on what other things you typically search for. Usually if you type in From Black to Light, it'll come up, but maybe you have bought a lot of black lights in the past. It may not take you to the bookstore. So if you use my name, Steve Black, and that title, it'll pop right up.
Awesome. Wow. Well, I know, Adam, I know what you're chomping at the bit to ask.
So obviously the show is called The Decision Hour, and one of the questions that we ask all of our guests is name a time in your life where your feet were on the line and you had to make a decision. It could be anything, whether it was, going to college, joining the military, starting a career, whatever the case may be. But tell us about your decision hour and what the atmosphere was like for you at that time.
There are so many variables and so many options, but I think the key one for me was 1987. Do I go to college? Do I not go to college? Do I follow my heart? Which what I really wanted to do was load up a backpack and go wander Europe. So I talked to a friend. He said, "Yes, let's do this." And I had this feeling right from day one that my friend somehow wasn't going to go through with it. But we got our passports. We were looking at money and squirreling things away. And sure enough, he backed out, and I went anyway. And I spent most of 1987 backpacking through Europe.
No
It
way.
was during that journey that I realized if I was ever going to be happy in life, I had to pursue music. I didn't know how. I didn't know if it would be as a musician or as an engineer. I didn't really even dream of radio at that point. But it was being out there, interacting in different cultures, living among people, learning how other people think in other countries, surrounding myself. Actually, here's a line that I've used many times before, but it's so accurate. If you want to learn something about yourself, get off a train in a place where you can't speak their language, you don't have their currency, and you don't know where you're going to sleep tonight. You will figure out some things about yourself.
That is incredible. I never even knew that about you. Wow.
Yeah. So that's what I did instead of going to college. And that, then a million other things happened while I was there. But that ultimate decision to just go. And by the way, 1987 was Cold War.
Yeah.
It was East and West Germany. It was no internet, no cell phones, no apps with maps to tell you how to get places, no Google Translate for languages, no European Union. So every country had its own currency. So you constantly had to rework how you were exchanging your money and what the money was worth. Fascinating times.
That's got to be probably one of the coolest decision hour stories I've ever heard. And I've been doing this for several years. That's freaking awesome. That'd be so cool to kind of travel back in time and do that. So you went an entire year over there, just backpacking Europe for a whole year.
It was 7 months, well, most of a year.
Golly, man, that's awesome. That's so cool.
And I did all the extremes you could think of. There were times when, to stay in budget, I essentially, didn't eat more than maybe a candy bar one day. There were other times when families treated me to excessive 14-course meals where I was, the star visitor from another country that they all wanted to meet and interact with, and had a roast that was cooked in 100-year-old wine for 2 days. And you literally experience it all. I had slept out under the stars underneath a castle one night because I wanted to stay on budget. I had another family in Finland. This will blow your mind. Their daughter had been an exchange student in America and learned so much and changed her life by coming here that when they discovered me in Finland, wanted to repay America. Not me, not that family, but America. They bought me my own apartment for a month in Finland to repay the kindness of America to their daughter.
Wow.
So I had my own apartment in Finland. I mean, it's just crazy, every extreme you could think of. But you have to be open to it, And by the way, that decision is not for everybody. If you took 100% of the people and they all went on that journey, 90% of them would not have enjoyed the journey, would not have learned from the journey. It's not for everybody. You have to be that explorer type person in order to take it in and function in that atmosphere.
I'm like going through the countries in my mind and that time in history, and that's awesome. That's awesome.
I think your next book needs to be like your life chronicles, Steve.
Well, that's what the first one is. Actually, chapter 2 is my entire journey through Europe. It's called.
Oh, wow.
Chapter 2 is called Far From Home.
Oh,
and I even took samples, or not samples, but little bits of the journal I kept from 1987 and reprinted those in chapter 2. So.
Oh my goodness! I know what I'm buying today. All right. Well, Adam, do you have any other questions for Steve that you'd like to ask as we start to wrap it up?
No, Steve, listen, I appreciate you taking time and coming up on the show today and letting our listeners and myself learn more about you. So I appreciate that very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Steve, thank you for being on the show. It was just so cool because I was trying to think of a really good guest that we could have on who was into music, and it just so happened to be that you popped right up on my screen, and I was like, oh my goodness, Steve.
Perfect timing. Yeah.
Yes. Perfect.
Yeah, I love what you guys are doing. I love, the podcasting revolution, because it's just another way for people to communicate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, even though social media has its purposes, it allows people to connect in such a way that they remain disconnected from each other. Mm-hmm. And it's when you get into these full conversations that you start to actually connect with each other. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Instead of just a visual connection. It becomes, more real, and we need more of that. So I'm glad that people are starting to listen to more podcasts. And so thank you for doing one or two or three.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for being on the show.
I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
All right.
Oh, that was awesome. I mean, I absolutely love it. Retro music, Steve, again, big shout out to Steve. Thanks for taking time out of his day to come join Patty and I. But we are up on time. So Patty, any closing words before we let everybody go?
No, I do think everybody should check out his book. We've had a few authors on the show, but this book. Yeah.
It's definitely, so we're gonna make sure that we have all of Steve's information up where you can follow him and where you can purchase his book. So make sure you check that out. Patty, anything else?
Oh, that's it.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Hey,
Thanks
real
for
quick
listening.
before we let you guys go, make sure you check out our home network, Heroes Media Group. Check out all the great shows, articles, sponsors that are coming on board. Simply go to www.heroesmediagroup.com. For Patty, I'm Adam. Until next time, you've been listening to The Decision Hour.